Okay, there's my cue to start. Hi everyone, hope you're having a lovely GCAP. My name's Jennifer, misspelt, and I'm the creative lead at Chaos Theory Games. While I have you loosely trapped for the next hour, I'd like to talk about our journey in developing the art direction for our first original IP, Crab God, which released earlier this year. I will also be talking about some of our processes, art assets, and points of technical implementation because it's all part and parcel of the trip, but at a fairly high level because there's a lot to cover, so hit me up afterwards if there's anything you'd like to hear more about. Now, for any of you here who are unfamiliar with how the game looks, here's a crunchy GIF to help you remember which Australian crab game you're here for. The premise of the game: you, the crab god, are dying, and it is time to ascend your successor. Guide your little colony of crablings and escort the sacred egg from your shallow home waters into more dangerous, murky ocean depths. Juggle resources, grow plants and corals to reinvigorate the local ecosystem, and gather enough food for each leg of the migration, all while fending off hostile creatures at night. Lose the egg, lose the game. Standard crab-type strategy. That's us. Hello, Chaos Theory Games, the ones with the jackets. If you say hi to us all, you get a trading card. You don't. Sorry, I don't know why I said that. As I was saying, this is our first original IP, but by no means our first rodeo. We typically work on a lot of games for change. We like playing games, making them, and we like games as a means of making a positive impact on the world, which is part of the reason we've ended up making so many games about the ocean without planning to. It's kind of a hot topic right now, only getting hotter, sorry. Some of you might have seen James's talk yesterday about shipping over 100 projects for clients. That's a long time spent on client projects, and while we've been able to do some really cool things that way, one of our goals has always been making our own games. So when we started thinking about Crab God 2 years ago, our team was absolutely thirsty for our own project that we could really sink our creative teeth into. So the developers leapt right into prototyping in Unity, while we, the art team, scrambled to make some sort of sense of things before art production started. And we followed something like our usual flow for art pre-production. First, we collated the information that we had: game details, art goals, budget, tech constraints, and so forth. This being the very start of the project, there naturally wasn't very much. Then we held an art jam. More details to come. After that, we produced a piece of key art indicative of the intended look and style of the game, and after that, the rest of the flipping owl, as they say, the beginnings of an art bible and enough work on asset pipelines to unblock the next chunk of work. So what information did we have at this point? We knew we wanted to make a game that had crabs, probably. It would likely be a side-scroller, inspired by the likes of Kingdom, Two Crowns, and Rias. There would be ecosystems of creatures lured in by the plants that you planted. And we knew that it would be a strategy game, probably aimed at a more casual audience, 18 to 32, healthy gender mix, people who might find something like Total War a bit daunting, or Total War players who might want to try relaxing for a change. We knew that we like oceans, and we wanted the player to walk away thinking, yeah, all right, oceans are pretty cool. Part of the game's revenue goes towards ocean conservation initiatives. It's a whole bit of a running theme. As such, our main art goal was to paint a flattering depiction of the ocean, reflecting real ecosystems in all their weirdness. This was also our chance to experiment with styles we might not usually try. Our team's pretty good at mobile-optimized graphics by now, but we'd just finished a PC project and we were hungry for more of this post-processing business, or having more than 0 to 1 lights in a scene. This is one of the reasons we opted to try Unity's HDRP pipeline, which we were passingly familiar with at the time from other non-game projects. There were a lot of out-of-the-box benefits like volumetric fog, SSR, temporal anti-aliasing, and we figured, if nothing else, it'd be an educational experience, as long as we never seriously considered something like, say, a switchboard in future. Okay, but issues that we could foresee at this point. Well, how does this scroll wheel work? Who knows? I'm good with tech. No, really, how does this? Where's my cursor? There we are. Apologies for the delays. Okay, so what have we got? Sporadic development. Client projects keep ticking. Artists might go for months without touching the project, especially early on when we've yet to validate anything. As such, onboarding needs to be easy. Information needs to be easy to access, readily available. We need to keep documentation up to date. There needs to be enough tracks laid ahead of time that when the artist train hits, there are things for it to do. Additional complication though, the game hadn't actually been designed yet, which is not unusual at the start of a project, but ideally art production doesn't get too far into the systems, and Crab God is a pretty systems-driven game. But here's where point one comes back to bite us. Since then, we've increased our design capacity, but since we're in the past here, all we can really do is future-proof, keep things flexible, try not to get in the way of changes or features that are likely or possible to happen. And both these points contribute to point three, morale. Who knows how long we'd be working on this for? Would we get a publisher? Would the project sink? Would the team hold faith throughout? This one's just the case with really most projects you work on. You can't trust the map if you don't know where the ship is headed. All we can do is make sure that everyone knows what's going on. So with these non-negotiables, we held an art jam, which is our silly name for our brainstorming sessions to get the whole art team's ideas on early art direction. To walk you through it, we start with a dossier for everyone. Basic project information, rough budget, who's going to be working on the project, and all the information I blabbed about earlier. Everyone then gets some prep time with this information to research and collect samples of any visual inspiration that they think could be a good fit for the project. It could be reference games or an aesthetic style or mood, color schemes, stylistic features, anything really. We then have a half-hour meeting because we are allergic to long meetings, and we're a small company that can get away with that kind of thing. And we take turns to explain our choices, highlight things that we like, comment on each other's selections, and so forth. The art lead then continues with pre-production, market research, concepting, and all that boring stuff, but armed with whatever thoughts were collected in the jam and are ready to spread. I'm quite fond of these jams as a process, and not just because they make my job easier. They're a formal way to give the whole team a voice in a project from the start, without descending into anarchy or design by committee. You see what ideas are the ones that get the team fired up, and importantly, you help keep the team on top of key information. Some of the takeaways that we got from the Crab Art Jam were that we favoured simplified shapes for easier readability, but we also wanted somewhat realistic materials and lighting so that we could milk those sweet, sweet ocean caustics from the water's surface or get God rays filtering into caves. But we still also wanted to steer away from the overwhelmingly blue screens so common in ocean games, quite possibly because we were a little sick of looking at blue screens by now. It's hard to avoid blue in an ocean game, and we didn't plan to, but we were going to have multiple biomes reflective of multiple ecosystems, so we decided different color palettes for each biome could work well with our game. So with all this, it's time to move on to creating a piece of key art. Developing a single piece of key art is something we like to do as a relatively quick way to experiment, get buy-in, make sure we're all on board with the visuals and how the pieces should fit together. And as reference material goes, it is significantly faster to create and understand a single piece of art than an entire art Bible. Importantly, it also gives our marketers and pitchers something to work with while the game still looks like trash. I do a little more research, but the target genre is nebulous enough that I don't at this point know what we want to specifically hit as much as what we want to specifically avoid. We don't want to look like a hardcore intense strategy, but we also don't want to look completely mind-off, juice-please machine. We don't want the harsh texture detail, lighting, and pants-wetting horror of Subnautica, but we don't want the toon, flatness, and surrealness of Absu, though both were perhaps predictably huge inspirations. So after a bit of time, this is what we land on. We got a lot of utility out of this first piece, even as the game and art evolved, but you do have to put some time into it before it's useful, and make a lot of decisions in the process, which is why what we first have actually looks more like this. Because it has been 3 days since the art jam, there's already been other projects going on. We haven't actually had time to design the crabs in Crab God. But at this point, we do. So Crab God herself took a bit of iteration and adjustment because we weren't sure, a running theme, of how we wanted her to look yet. I hope you appreciate my honesty in putting these unpolished thumbnails in front of you. But thankfully, they are not all mine. Okay, this is the luxury that comes of thumbnailing for yourself and a team that you've worked with for a long time and not a client. Words that got thrown, oh God, someone's taking a picture. Words that got thrown around a lot early were eldritch, terrifying, majestic, stone-cold predator, which could have made for a pretty cool but somewhat different game. We didn't want the player to go around smiting crabs, we wanted them to care for them, so we pushed for more of a friendly nature deity that also happened to be a giant crab. We looked at decorator crabs as a precedent in nature of crabs that dress themselves in pretty awesome coral drip. But while drawing this out, I noticed that the spines along the edge of the carapace, or the anterolateral teeth, if you want the proper term, translated pretty well in my mind to temple finials. Thai temples, in particular, have what I believe are called lamyong, symbolic of creatures like Naga and Garuda, so great, let's lean into that. Other natural godly imagery that seemed to integrate naturally was the tree of life, Yggdrasil, or any other number of variants throughout time. People like trees, they just look holy, they come pre-packaged with metaphors, so bam, stick a tree on her face. I'll admit the one I was visualizing while drawing this was mostly the Tree of Gondor, but the role the crablings had to play was a lot clearer. They just had to be cute. They're the mascot characters, they had to be easy to brand, easy to recognize, easy to love. T-shirt material, in Nico's words. The cuter the crab, the more we, the player, care about getting them to the end alive and well. We're shallow like that. Now, cute is not my specialty, so I hope you'll indulge a brief segue into the simple formula that I use as a crutch for this, based on skimming a few pages of Google image results for cute character. But it hasn't failed me yet, so I am sticking to it. First, roundness. The shape of a friend. We love round. Round is safe. Round is easy to hold. Round is easy to visually process. It has no evil attention-grabbing spikes. You have to do a lot of work to make round look threatening. Disproportion. Bits are too damn big for other bits. The head is half the body. The ears don't fit. The eyes are teeny on a big ball of buffy fur. Why is this cute? Possibly related to humans finding babies cute. Babies are famously disproportionate. I think it might be somewhat related to how easy to tip over they look, but who knows? It's not just big heads and small bodies, though. We could have big, bulky behemoths that are still cute because they have tiny heads and stubby little legs. Baymax from Big Hero 6 is a good example of this, but he's also got a lot of roundness working for him. The third factor is probably something you can guess. Eyes. Yeah, put a set of googly eyes on a trash can and suddenly no one's littering. This has infinite potential. Now, obviously, this is just a starting point. I'd say you need 2 of these 3 things, but even with all 3, you can very easily twist these back until you've made something quite dreadful. By playing with factors like healthiness, mismatched level of detail, expressiveness, and at some point we do have to admit defeat and accept there's some level of subjectivity. But trust in the formula and it can take you quite a bit of the way there. Playing with these 3 factors was literally just how I figured out the crablings. Again, apologies for the scribbles. I have no in-between shots from these to finished. But you can see the alpha crabling beginning to emerge from each of these. The nicest thing about designing cute is that it's really easy to test for. You know you've hit the mark when you get that immediate audible "aww" reaction from people. That was our literal benchmark for design success here, to count the number of awes we got from the first few playtesters. It wasn't a very rigorous count, so I couldn't give you a number, but it was enough that we called it a day. Beyond the cuteness thing and having arms that could gesture and reach for things, the only thing I really cared about was making sure that they had 10 legs. Simply because if they don't have 10 legs, they're not a true crab. Hermit crabs, by the way, not true crabs. They walk forwards instead of sideways. Fun little crab fact for you there. So these are the crabs that we ended up with. Note the plant on the 4th crabling there. We didn't have plans for hats from the start per se, but we knew on a subconscious level that there would be hats. If you want players to get attached to your creatures, you need cuteness clauses 3A and 3B. Let them name them and let them wear hats. It all comes back to what eyes do. We're anthropomorphizing them. So after all this, we put a little more time into cleaning up the prototype, which in the absence of an artist was looking surprisingly okay because of all the ocean games we'd been making. But the presence of the key art meant that this prototype didn't really need to reflect the game visuals as urgently, and we could take some more time to establish asset pipelines. So we got the beginnings of an art Bible up basically by reverse engineering what would be needed to get something like the key art in engine. We got some basic down. Project information, scale, colors, shape guides, notes on consistent asset importing because some artists prefer Maya and some prefer Blender. You can decide which is which. The writing of it was gradual. The art Bible is expected to evolve as we figure things out, so generally we just wrote enough that the available or free artists would have enough to go off, which at the beginning was guidance for biome concepting for myself and an asset pipeline for plants, since that would probably be reusable for a fair number of assets. But we still eventually ended up with a fair amount of implementation notes in there, potentially too many for such a text-heavy document, but that's something we shifted away from later down the line as well. At any rate, with all that done, we can finally start making things. We don't want the whole game to look the same. We want tangible progression. We want to show more bits of the ocean. So, biomes. We ended up with 5, each with different danger levels, strategies, and ecosystems associated with them. When designing them, we looked for cool underwater scenes, like the cenotes in Mexico, or real underwater biomes, like kelp forests and brine pools. And then we picked a spread that was spaced throughout different ocean depths. And then our poor designers had to come up with food webs that were somewhat accurate to these biomes. We wrote brief, simple vibe summaries for both art and music to reference. The home waters summary, for instance, safe, warm, welcoming. The volcanic region was dangerous, dark, seething pits of fire. Each biome had 3 main hues used throughout to keep it instantly recognizable. We picked colors with low value ranges and made sure each set of 3 was a mix of cool and warm hues. High and low values were reserved for UI, interactables, and key points of interest. These colors are all actually implemented in Engine using global shader variables. Most of our environment textures are completely unsaturated. This was partly to make sure that these scenes did in fact conform to our 3-color rule, and partly because it made tweaking and experimenting really easy. But mostly it was for paranoid future-proofing. What if we decided later that every level needed to look different? What if we added 8 more biomes and we were running out of colors? What if we needed to temporarily change things up for seasonal events? Well, that one's actually happening now. Happy Halloween. We stuck a moon in, we stuck some pumpkins in, picked 3 colors, and bam, done, easy. Definitely worth the entire level color system. Some cool side effects, though, were that we could have Crab God's antlers change color with the level that she's in, and some of the plants do as well, so yay. Here's our favorite biome, the kelp forest. This was the last biome we made, I think, and the process was a touch more refined. Thanks to Callum, who we had come on to help with this since we were running out of hands at the time. Those moving god rays, by the way, are shadows cast by a few of the swaying kelp. Just a few, because having them all cast shadows doesn't make that much visual difference, but does make a performance one. And here's the final level type that you reach in-game, the volcanic ridge. Thanks to Morgan for the sick lava. Lava underwater generally doesn't stay orange for very long, but what else is going to bring orange into your palette 2.5 kilometers under the sea? You might have noticed that each biome has a layer of visual effects and post-processing to give it an underwater feel. There's some variation between biomes, but there are a few constants. Fog is the most important for a sense of depth and impenetrable water. Plenty of ocean games on mobile or VR just add a fake blue fog and then call it a day. It's a little fancier here. We have an animated 3D texture for the fog. We also got to play with lens warping and chromatic aberration around the edges to simulate the weird refractive vision you get underwater, but we did have to tone it down because it turns out that's actually pretty annoying in-game. But at least we got to try depth of field to emphasize the depth and keep the crablings looking small. But again, only in some scenes and in moderation, because it turns out HDRP depth of field is not that performant either. Visual effects are scattered throughout the scene and anchored to the camera as well, so the player can never really escape the wisps of floating plankton, seaweed, fish poop and bubbles that plague the ocean. Ocean scenes don't look right unless they're in constant motion, which is why we have the caustic lighting in shallower levels constantly moving. And when we're in deeper levels, we replace that with things like lava or the bubbling surfaces and drifting haze in the brine pools. Post-processing was also how we handled our day-night cycles in-game. We had an additional 3 post-processing volumes and configuration settings for the main light in each biome to override the default values at sunset, night, and sunrise. There's an additional fog at night to help dim the backgrounds even more. And there's a global shader property, night glow, that gets switched on at night so that every shader with that property can fluoresce. Individual tuning values in each material determine how strongly they're affected so that the bioluminescent fish, like lanternfish, can start beaming at night while damselfish continue to be plain and boring. We weren't actually sure for a good chunk of the project whether we would be procedurally generating levels or not, so we designed all of these biomes on the assumption that we would be. Future-proofing again, and a good job too, because we did end up procedurally generating these levels, just not at runtime. So we had a standardized list of pieces and reference sheets like this for every biome for the modelers to work off, at least 6 ground pieces, some set dressing elements from which we could then set up some prefabs in Unity, background pieces, level edge pieces, some framing in front and behind each ground piece. All the pieces in every biome share the same minimum dimensions with some buffer on either side for nice overlap. They all level out to the same height on either end, except for the uphill and downhill, which extend up and down by the same amount in every biome. To cover the seams between the ground pieces and to highlight the playable area, we have a separate sand or foliage mesh on top with a world space material that ignores the mesh normals to therefore look seamless. Pete, Crab God's technical lead, set up a pretty nice system for generating these levels, but it did need some artist setup. We have markers on each side of each ground piece in Unity to indicate where Pete's tool should join them up, and a whole bunch of extra transforms for every possible location that a starting object can spawn. More magic in the tool made sure that certain things couldn't overlap in any game-breaking ways. We had some tools to automate the placement of these transforms eventually, but an artist would still need to go in, check, tweak, fix, amend. So these assets that you see in here are not the actual rocks or ritual stones used in-game. They're proxy visual prefabs that we used so that we can edit the actual assets without 10-minute delays every time every single prefab containing them updates. What this means is a ground piece could be generated in scene with 3 different foregrounds and backings, or without a foreground and backing, which means 12 variations per ground piece even before any of the market objects are generated. And put all together, here's Pete's magic generator in action. Pieces get randomly strung together, designers can set the biome, the chance of each ground piece spawning, what elements they'd like to spawn, how many and how densely they should spawn, the size of the level, and all of these are saved in a configuration file so that when new gameplay features are added, a designer can just reload the configuration file, add a few things, and regenerate the level again from that. With each biome comes the different set of environment pieces, music, camera following visual effects, lighting configurations, level colors, and day-night settings. So the moral here is really just to be nice to your programmers. Now that levels are all set up, we've still got a lot of plantables to create. Plants and corals were difficult to standardize. It turns out they come in some pretty wildly different shapes. Every plant can be upgraded 3 times, and in most cases we just had more meshes animate in and stack additively on top of the lower levels, sometimes with everything scaling up a bit as well. Color is, again, set in engine. What we have are a normal map, emission mask, AO mask, roughness, opacity, secondary color mask, and 2 animation masks packed into 3 textures. We briefly toyed with the idea of having them interact with fish and crabs passing by, but we were in unknown waters at this point. There were so many interactions that could happen, like fish eating plants, plants vanishing as they get eaten, so our future-proofing artist third eye decided, don't be dumb, don't create these potential tech and performance issues even if it looks really cool, when it could get in the way of functionality. There are plenty of other places we can be dumb in future without risking the loss of work. And those features were indeed added later, so phew. Not to mention that cool things like this wouldn't even apply to every plantable. A lot of corals don't even move and they just sit there like rocks. But for everything else, we went with a shader approach. Here's a look at our bubble kelp, the first plant that we made, and an early version of its material with incomplete textures. All of our shaders were made in Amplify because we're more on the art side than the tech side in the shader team. We're transitioning over to ShaderGraph more these days, but there are some really nice things in Amplify that just aren't in ShaderGraph at the moment, like tessellation, light color, UI shaders. And at this point, we also weren't married to HDRP yet, and thinking of the future, converting shaders in Amplify to URP is a little less painful. The current animation is really just a lot of sines stacked on top of each other. We have an overall bend value just swaying back and forth, stacked with a sine animating along the length of the plant. These are both offset from the base of the plant using the position of the object transform so it's not sliding through the ground all over the place. These sines and bends are also world-based in rotation, so we can rotate the plants around for visual variation while maintaining a consistent ocean current direction. Then there's another individual wave along the length of each leaf. This one is made up of 2 stacked sine waves of different frequencies, so they look a bit more turbulent and the motion is a little less perfect. We use an animation texture mask to determine the areas affected and the leaf normals, which we've set to perpendicular from the leaf's face to determine the direction of the sine. There's also a height offset value to add some randomness along the height of the plant so that the leaves aren't signing in perfect unison. And then there's an additional ripple along the edges of the leaf, again using a texture mask. Maybe a little excessive, but if you layer them all together, this is the end result. We had a few more miscellaneous features in there to let plants grow in and out as they were planted or eaten. UVs were lined up from top to bottom in order of how we wanted them to vanish, leaves first, so we wouldn't be left with floating leaves as the stem vanished. and then some miscellaneous overlays for different effects of the plant, or for when it's moused over. Some of these, like the bleaching white, are relics of old gameplay design that were later discarded. Exposed shader settings and nice checkbox switches like these are incredible for experimenting, but once you have the look you want, it's really best to just hide them. Throw out the switches and branches, make new shaders with whatever settings you want from them, remake them from scratch if you must. Just do not push this to master. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200 or 2,000 shader variants, as the case may be. Otherwise, the devs will frantically be wondering why their build is taking 3 hours while there's a showcase in 2 hours, and you're happily tapping away oblivious on a different project. But here's a few plantables that did end up using the same shader. As a completely unrelated tangent, it is very irritating having plants, corals, and animals in a project just for naming conventions. It's one of those things that you end up arguing about far more than you should, but in the end we settled on growables for plants and stationary corals, just because that was their function in-game. But for reference, that top right one there isn't even a coral, it's some kind of stationary jellyfish, and the middle left one is a type of worm that creates this hardened shell for itself. The ocean is actually ridiculous. And some examples of plantables that couldn't use this material because they were either rock still, for which I thank them, or just weird. Green mussels in the top right, mushroom coral in the bottom right. We found very early that we were dealing with a lot of assets simultaneously and at different points in production. So while we're generally quite married to Jira for project tracking, it's a flexible arrangement. Using something more visual like Miro let us get a quicker idea of how everything was looking all at once. And bafflingly, this visual method of tracking assets was a lot more popular with artists. So it's easy for me, at least, to see asset progress when there are nice big screenshots there and Slack integrations pinging me with messages. And artists felt more free to put progress updates up there. Something like my crummy thumbnails, for instance, can be hard to put on Jira, where every producer and their mother gets pinged. It's a lot easier for everyone to drop comments on other people's works or hype them up, that sort of thing. And once we're ready to progress these assets, we then update Jira, so our poor producers don't need to keep tabs on multiple links. It's also a really easy way to hold retros. We could leave our notes in a nice visual format and then just scroll to the side where we've got everything spread out if we needed a refresher on what had been done recently or what was still in progress. In future, I would be keen to see how much more Art Bible content we could integrate into something like this, or at least include links out to the Art Bible more consistently, just to reduce how much work an artist needs to do to find information. But with all that boring stuff aside, let's get back to assets. I am throwing some creature concepts in here because they'll never see the light of day again otherwise. Again, attempting to future-proof, we created a few base creature body types that could all share animations, with the intention that we could do a few mesh edits and palette skinnings and reskins and produce a lot more creature types that way. There are, after all, a lot of very similarly shaped fish. Basic fish used vertex animation in their shaders, a sign along the body with an offset and fall-off so that the head didn't ripple, a side-to-side motion and a bit of rotation, a little optional wiggle on the fins that could be configured, and later on we added blend shapes for exaggerated eating animations. You can zoom in and see these fish close up in the encyclopedia, but for the most part in-game they're pretty tiny, so these eating animations had to be somewhat exaggerated. We made a variant on the same material with the main animating sign going in an up-down direction instead for the hypothetical army of stingrays and mantas that we'd one day have. We only ended up having one, but we were ready if we ever decided to have more. And we did end up reusing this material for sea snails, of all things, which definitely according to plan. Sharks and whales were a little too long for us to get away with completely vertex animating, so they all share a rig structure with some joints moved around to match fin positioning. Separate animations because sharks and whales move quite differently, and while the intention was for them to simply use joint animation to eat, we found a blend shape was a much easier way to get the weird jaw unhinging thing that goblin sharks do. So all these body types saved some time, but then we had the weirdo category, the ones that are just a bit fishy, the creatures that didn't conform to any of these existing shapes. And this last category ended up being somewhat larger than hoped for, mostly because a lot of fish-shaped fish serve very similar purposes in the ecosystem, and we wanted a mix of predators and fish that ate predators and predators that eat fish that eat predators. And we all had our favorite creatures that we sort of wanted to throw into the ring like Pokemon, but alas, reality gets in the way. I'm still a little crabby that we couldn't get bioluminescent jellyfish, but concessions must be made, and we didn't want octopi on the list for animator sanity. Of course, squid ended up sneaking on the list instead, but we did a little bit of cheating there. We grouped the tentacles together, reduced the complexity of the animation, and where some creatures brought complications with them, others were thankfully a lot simpler. Shout out to the greatest sea creature of them all, the sea urchin, for literally being a ball. The hero we didn't deserve. And while I'm at it, a shout out to Morgan, Theo, and Jacob for their work on these creatures and all the rest, by the way. This is a case where it's really hard to pin down specific work to specific artists because we were all on top of everything at some point. But between asset production, everything else keeps swimming on. In October 2023, we sign on with FireSquid as a publisher, so that's nice. But with that comes an actual deadline and a more definitive limit to our scope. With a deadline, it becomes clearer how much content we can fit in the time available, so we finalize biome and creature numbers, cutting a few and shifting the food web to compensate. I haven't really talked about UI much because that's a whole talk in itself, but also because our monster of a UI artist, Casey, just gets things done. New features get added to the game, and we have a lovely Figma where he lines up options and we can pick through them like sommeliers. Yes, this one's delightfully clear, or some heavy, casual mobile notes in this one. Iterate until the palette is cleansed. Success. For a brief time, when things are particularly confusing, we do daily artist stand-ups, something we generally avoid because long meetings are the enemy. But we do playtests, art whips. Gameplay goes through some drastic changes in response, and for the most part, art holds off on making anything because of how experimental all these changes are. For a moment, Crab God can smite things, and then she can't again, sorry. Crab rolls are eventually introduced, and implementation is easy and already planned for, because we knew that there would one day be hats and tools slid in smoothly. And then actual cosmetics are introduced after all, so we need to do some tweaking to make sure they don't interfere with the new roll system. Oh. But again, my inability to scroll. But yeah, for that matter, all we do from here really is just keep on cranking assets, and the result is the next slide anyway. There we are. And it's something we're pretty proud of. The reception has been kind, a lot of nice things have been said about the art, the environments, the lighting, and the crabs, in yet another striking success for the cute formula. Some marine biologists came out of the woodwork at showcases and the like to tell us how happy we were that we'd included some creatures. Had we considered including so-and-so? And I do regret that we couldn't get them plankton. But just as significant and a bigger takeaway for me was that the team was happy with the work that they'd done, and that in spite of all the issues and uncertainties, the people wanted more crab. So how did we do? Well, development took around 2 years, but we did the math, by which I mean James did the math, and we spent around 3,300 hours on the art, which sounds like a lot to me because time is an nonsensical construct, but equivalent to 3 full-time artists for half a working year. Nevertheless, with everything on a shared Miro board, getting up to date was relatively easy, though our art Bible is now sadly lagging behind by a few gameplay iterations, so success. Now, the gameplay made remarkable strides after we signed with FireSquid, but there were no real curveballs we hadn't planned for. ProcGen was anticipated, roles were easily added, assets were flexible, so success. No issues whatsoever. Morale. Did we communicate well? Was morale maintained? I don't know. The art team is literally like, here, guys, do you like crabs still?
Yes!
Okay, there you go. Good enough for me. Our processes are a constant work in progress, but it feels like we're doing something right in terms of making avenues for the whole team to give input and keep everyone updated. So with that, thank you for listening to my silly little talk, and here's a QR code, should you want the slides for some godforsaken reason. If anyone has any questions, there's a microphone right there, or shout them out, or otherwise, how was your day?
Hello, hi.
Hello.
Great talk, amazing looking game. My main
stranger.
question for you was just on the
production side for the art. In your opinion, what was the main sort of the strongest point in your setup, and what is something that you wish you could have changed?
Production side. I mean, that point I've mentioned about design sort of happening simultaneously with art was a huge production blocker at the time. And we felt it was unavoidable at the time, but we've certainly been taking steps to avoid that in future and in our current projects. But in terms of successes, I do like that we were flexible, and that is something that we can do when we were a small studio working on a bunch of projects at the same time. We could pivot and test out different things. Like the Miro board wasn't something that we had at first, but switching to that, we found immediate results. People were, artists were immediately knocking at the door to say, yes, please, no more Jira for this at least. So.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes.
What were your design solutions for people who are deathly afraid of the ocean?
Well, we have a very, I think, stylized view of the ocean in some respects, a bit of a Finding Dory approach where we avoided any majorly thalassophobic elements or excessive giant gaping void, dark pits, that sort of thing. We do have some somewhat spooky elements at night when the threats come out, and no, there isn't really any insurance for that. But for the most part, we kept our oceans friendly, presentable, round shapes on all the creatures to keep them friendly and approachable, and that sort of thing. Well, yeah, okay, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
So it sounds like you did a lot of future-proofing, and when you were making things, you were really thinking ahead of like, what might we do to this later? Did that really pay off, did you find? Was there ever anything where you put extra effort in and then were like, we didn't end up doing that? Was it worth the extra work to future-proof?
It is almost always worth the effort to future-proof. Like there are some instances where you future-proof it and you think, oh yeah, I'm so clever, I've seen this thing that will happen in the future, and then it doesn't happen, but that's okay, it was there. And there are many instances where, in the instance of ProcGen levels, for instance, we were all thanking our stars. Yeah, I struggle to remember any details of the project at the moment because it's all a bit of a blur, but it very rarely doesn't pay off to future-proof your assets in general. And if anything else, it also sets you up for future projects when these things come up again.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'd be interested in learning more about that switch to Miro. Our team's just started looking at Miro for the art team. What were some of the things you learned adapting Miro into your workflow?
Okay, so repeating that question for the microphone, they were interested in learning more about our switch to Miro, especially for artists. This is again something, it was more a process of trial and error, so to speak. So what was the information that we were having trouble keeping track of? What was the information that we weren't getting from artists, or what did artists not feel comfortable in our existing pipeline doing? So we set up our Miro board pretty much just to answer these questions. We had trouble getting really, really rough drafts, so we set up a board with examples where everyone, myself included, would put up incredibly rough work just to encourage that. We would have discussions with the Miro board. I asked every artist what they thought of the format, if they thought there was anything that it needed, and we continued to adapt that as the project continued. There wasn't really a perfect solution from the start, if that answers.
Yes, awesome, thank you.
If there's anyone else? Yes.
So how rigid were the guidelines for the art jam that you did at the start? Was there kind of like, also like with references to other media, did each kind of person have their own references to maybe like other games or shows, or
Yeah.
was there kind of like a universal list of things you guys all had to kind of work towards?
We have our guidelines for the project, and they're mostly for... Well, the guidelines were things like, this is an ocean game, don't come with references for a first-person shooter, maybe. But part of the art jam is to sort of see what gets everyone excited, so everyone can bring really what they want. Maybe they've just looked at a picture recently, or they've been following an illustrator and they think, oh, this looks really cool, and I think maybe even unrelated to this project, it would be nice if we worked on this at some point. So I'm going to bring it to the art jam and I'm going to pitch it and I'm going to talk about why I like this. This is really just, I mean, partly an excuse to froth over cool art, but also, yeah, it's just a chance to see what everyone on the team is thinking. So I prefer to be less rigid, but depending on how many people you have, you might find you need to have clearer guidelines. Yes?
Hello. Was there a particular system that you found most effective for managing different feedback from different people and also managing approvals for each asset, like during different stages of creation?
Mm-hmm. In general, for approval, we have one person who approves an asset, though one person who gives the final approval, but everyone can give input and that person can take that input into account, is the system that we go with. Obviously, it's a bit chaotic if everyone's feedback has to be put in before we can finalize a piece, but it is nice to see, because sometimes one person is not infallible, one person can miss things, and everyone, I think, enjoyed having the ability to give input where they could. But there was an understanding that it wasn't necessarily Bible and that their input wasn't going to be law. Okay, if that's everything, thank you for coming.